very much, Congressman. We here at NUFDI certainly appreciate your leadership, especially your insistence on the importance of bipartisanship on this issue, and what a perfect segue to this next panel, which we are pleased to have a real treat of diversity and really impressive views across the spectrum here. Could not be more thrilled for today's bipartisan panel, led by one of Washington's most capable journalists, Shaun Tandon of Agence France-Presse, the State Department correspondent. Thank you all. Shaun, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening. As Kamran mentioned, this is a very timely panel, certainly, in terms of what we're seeing, what we seem to be seeing right now. So it's a bipartisan panel, so we should get a variety of viewpoints here. So let me go and briefly introduce people. I think people probably know most of the speakers here. Morgan Ortagus, somebody I'm used to asking questions to, former spokesperson for the State Department under the previous Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Takeyh, at the senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, well-known author. Most recently, The Last Shah, America, Iran, and the Fall of the Pahlavi Dynasty. Aramesh, a political analyst and commentator, analyst from the Democratic Party. Brian Katulis, long time at the Center for American Progress, where he remains a non-resident senior fellow, and now Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute. And last but not least, Saeed Ghasseminejad, Senior Advisor at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, an expert on the Iranian economy. So let's begin with perhaps looking in general terms. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. We've heard the administration, we've heard the Europeans as well speak about a deal being within sight, that this could come any time now. There could be a resumption. Of course, the Jcpoa was in 2015, and we've had the administration also warning that, perhaps that there are only a few weeks left before before it doesn't make any sense to be in the Jcpoa anymore. It no longer is useful. So what can we see now? I mean, if we see, do you think we'll have an agreement, a resumption of it? And if we do, what will the effects be? If this isn't 2015 anymore, the previous administration withdrew in 2018. What effects would we really see if there is a return to this? So maybe Morgan, start with you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's interesting that you all stressed being a bipartisan panel, which I think is great, because I think this is the least bipartisan issue maybe in all of foreign policy right now. So I think we'll have a strong and robust debate. And I think it's incredibly important. But the reality is, and all of you just heard the Congress, the political reality is that there are very stark lines between the two parties right now on this. And I don't see it being resolved in the deal, at least the way it's being reported. Now, when Secretary Blinken was being confirmed before the Congress, he said he was going to shoot for a longer and stronger deal. And I thought, okay, let's hear him out what he has to say. Since then, if you read your people reporting around the world, it not only seems like we're not even going to get close to the target of a longer and stronger deal. I think the deal, at least as it's being presented, again, reported in the media, looks to be, for those of us who are against the Jcpoa, looks to be even worse than the original deal in 2015. So you still have the political reality that if and when Republicans get back in power, I won't speak for Congressman Waltz, but I'm pretty sure he and most Republican nominees for president in 24 will probably pledge to get out of said deal again. So I think we have to figure out, if there is any sort of bipartisan way to treat this. I'm just being honest, and I know this is a little depressing. I don't see it. I think it was a fatal flaw by the Obama administration not to take it before the Senate, not to make it a treaty. And so now it's, now it's a political football. And essentially because I think Mike Pompeo, President Trump, and people on my side of the aisle saw the 2015 deal as a very flawed deal. We see what's happening today is even being worse, because if you do things like take terrorism sanctions off of Iran, when they have done nothing, in my opinion, to deserve having those sanctions taken off. We could go into a longer discussion. When you were covering us, we were able to get Sudan off the state sponsor of terrorism list. So there is a path to get out from under those terrorism sanctions, but under the guise of a failed nuclear deal, I don't see the path. And then finally, I would just say, and I know we're going to get into specifics, I think that we have been caught in this mindset since 2015. And in my opinion, it's a failed mindset of a deal or war. And I don't think the options are that stark. And that is the sort of vicious cycle that we have whenever both parties debate this deal, the efficacy of going back in this deal, as we are constantly told, the American people are constantly told that it's a deal or it's war. And I just don't buy that premise.
I think I largely agree with Morgan.
Really?
Yeah. Well, she came prepared. I have to, I would say, just in terms of few additions, the current Iranian government is not going to go back to the 2015 deal, just in terms of their own domestic considerations, because they have done so much to criticize it. So, and I don't think there is going back to 2015. So, by definition, this deal is going to be inferior to the 2015 deal. If you had problems with 2015 deal, which I did, then this is by definition is going to be an inferior agreement. I don't know what the technical provisions of it is, because they haven't explicated them. But by all accounts, the Iranians are going to get a very substantial measure of sanctions relief. What they say in the Iranian press, there's a lot of jubilation. They seem to have settled on the nuclear part of the agreement, and they're quibbling over the sanctions relief. And also, you always hear that the Iranians are insisting that America provides some kind of guarantees where the successor administration will not abrogate their obligation under a deal. I mean, they understand that that's not going to happen. So what they're trying to do is use that particular talking point to extract more concessions. And those concessions are likely to be extracted on snapback provisions. Whether you could build some sort of a blockage in terms of snapback provisions so they don't snap back as easily and effortlessly. But anyway, I think they're sophisticated enough to understand that they're not going to get a letter from Mitch McConnell saying we're going to adhere to whatever the agreement does. But so that is additional leverage they use in terms of extracting concessions. If you have noticed the couple of things, if you've been around this issue for a long time, which regrettably I have, it follows a very predictable pattern. Whenever there's a stalemate in the negotiations, the administration says, there's only 2 weeks left, 3 weeks left, we're not going to negotiate forever. Tony Blinken said that in September. By his own definition, his timeline has expired. And then they said, well, we're going to pursue Plan B, and the final step is usually capitulation at the negotiating table. We're in phase 3 now. So I do think there will be an agreement. I don't know exactly when, but I suspect that will come within a couple of weeks and months, I don't know. And I think it'll be a difficult agreement. The Jcpoa was the most radical arms control agreement, I would say, in annals of American arms control diplomacy for the following reasons. It was the only time that the United States conceded enrichment capability and stipulated that that enrichment capability will be industrialized to an adversarial nation. That had never happened before. So it's a radical agreement. Its proponents often suggest differently. It was a profoundly radical revision of American non-proliferation policy as articulated by successive administrations. And so this agreement is going to be even more deficient. And one of the things, if you look at what the State Department spokesperson and others are saying, they're no longer talking about longer and stronger. That has sort of mysteriously been excised from their conversation. The next talking point you're going to hear is the Iranian program is back in the box. I agree that this is a very controversial and polarizing agreement. The two parties have different perspectives on it. I don't see that perspectives being bridged, certainly not by this agreement. But also, honestly, we can have perspective on this. I don't know how urgent priority it is for either party. I tend to believe that the Biden administration, I'm not part of the council, believe they have a lot of political running room on this because of all the other concerns about inflation, pandemic, Ukraine, Russia, China, and so forth, that it's just no longer the priority that it was in 2015. So I think they believe that they have greater degree, they have less domestic political vulnerability on this than it is believed. I don't know if they're right or not, but that certainly, I think, guides their guides their priorities. They can be permissive with some measure of impunity. I'm not sure if they're wrong about that, frankly.
I want to take a step back. If the Iranian regime is homicidal, but it's definitely not suicidal. You look back at the last 42 years since the 79 revolution, you see there is a consistent ideological core to what the Islamic Republic is pursuing as foreign policy. This is expanding Iranian sphere of influence in the region. For the most part, sort of countering what American interest, Israeli interest, and sort of the anti-American, anti-Israeli ideology is in the very center of what the Iranian regime has been spreading. But there's a prerequisite to achieve these international or foreign policy goals. You can't have foreign policy goals if you do not have an existing regime. So regime survival is at the very core. And the Islamic Republic has shown in action and in rhetoric that they will do everything and anything to make sure that the regime survives. Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the regime, the Islamic Republic sets something that Hifz al-Nizam as awjab wajibat, to protect the Islamic State is of the highest priority, meaning if you have to shut down even the month of Ramadan, but to protect the Islamic system, you have to do so because that is the essential and the most important goal of the Islamic Republic. So the past 32 years under Ali Khamenei's leadership, someone who has viewed America as a source of problem. He was a student of even Sayyid al-Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood figure, was a Sunni Muslim, but Khamenei was one of the very first, if not the first person who translated his works from Arabic into Farsi. He's always viewed the West, among the West, the US, as a problem, as untrustworthy, as sort of, you know, the evil empire, for lack of a better word. And they've had an advantage. There has been consistent leadership and consistent messaging for the past 42 years coming from Tehran. They have committed blood and treasure to expand and to their foreign policy goals. We live in a democracy. So every 4 years, sometimes every 8 years, in the case of Reagan, Bush, every 12 years, you have a new party in charge. Now, sometimes policy may be radically different, sometimes it may not. When a president negotiates a deal, yes, we couldn't get that through the Senate because, yes, Article 3, Section 8, you get a treaty passed by 60 senators, it becomes the law of the land. It would have been great. It didn't have the votes. I mean, there were not enough votes. And then overnight, President Trump walks out of the deal. Even as a Democrat, I got to say, and as someone who's not a fan of President Trump, I got to say a couple things he did I liked. Not walking out of Jcpoa, but I think putting more pressure on Iran and putting more pressure on IRGC, and especially taking out the Quds Force commander, Soleimani. And again, even within one political party, there are varying differences in foreign policy. It's a big party, so people can disagree on this. But everybody expected mayhem after Soleimani's death, and we saw not much happen. And in fact, Iranians decided to retaliate in a way that did not really hurt Americans, so we did not have to hit them back. So going back to sort of my main theme is that there has been consistency within this theocracy, and that is anti-American, anti-Israeli, anti-status quo, and to be the destabilizing force in the region. That has been the case since the very first day of the Islamic Revolution till today. We live in a democracy, and our policymakers come and go, things change, and sometimes we go for maximum pressure, sometimes we don't. Either way, and last point, and we can debate this, I don't think Republican or Democratic administrations, the concept of regime change and what it really is, it's never been the agenda. I think the closest that the Islamic Republic came to feel threatened was right after the Iraq War, after President Bush invaded Iraq. Even during President Trump, or President Reagan, President Bush the father, Clinton, Obama, and Biden, the regime change, meaning actually committing assets and resources, it's never been on the agenda. And there's legal reasons for that. It goes back to sort of the Algiers. So, but yeah, consistency coming from Tehran for doing bad things, and inconsistency coming from Washington because I'm lucky to say we live in a democracy, so people come and go. So.
Thanks. Brian?
Great. Thanks for having me here, and it's really great to be on this panel and to meet you, actually. We've talked many times on the phone. I would say the question of whether or not there's a deal almost doesn't matter on two very important points. One is the regional security, the security dynamics in the Middle East, which are awful. And if one lesson I take from 2015 to present, when we had a deal and when we didn't, you had a number of activities driven by the regime in Tehran that undermined security in the region. And I think, as a clinical analyst, and I'll get to the politics in a second, but if you take a step back and look neutrally across what I would say several Democratic and Republican administrations, you have a US policy that's looking at the Middle East right now and essentially saying, first, we got to pivot elsewhere, we've got to rebalance, we got to get others to pull their weight under Trump, but it's not strategically consistent in the Middle East, and our partners and our adversaries know it, and they exploit it. If I could characterize the approach on Iran, that I think is a bipartisan tradition, it is one of appeasement, passive appeasement of a regime that actually does things every day to undermine the stability in the region, and then in the second arena, to undermine its own people and the basic decency and support for human rights. And quite frankly, if you take a look back at, again, the last several administrations, there really is not a coherent approach in those two areas. And again, I do think it's important whether they get a deal or not, or whether it's stronger or longer, but understand what I'm saying is that those fundamentals of the US not really having a steady, clear approach in the Middle East, and again, just trying to be honest about my friends in the Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, the overarching theme is it's China now, or maybe this month it's been Russia, and then we've got problems here in our own democracy. And to me, again, that's a bit of the show that we have in our politics. We saw it a bit with the congressman, and I respect a lot of sort of his remarks. Wish Congressman Sherman would offer some thoughts, because I think they wouldn't fundamentally be that far off on these two key points, regional security and support for the Iranian people, because it's there. If you look at public opinion polls of Americans, Iran is not viewed in a very positive light. There is an opportunity that panels like this, not so much, I don't think, this panel, but mostly Twitter and the social media debate about Iran, all it does is really fragment the potential for a consensus about what a full spectrum approach on Iran might look like. And again, the two things that I think are missing, deal or no deal, one is a clearer, more coherent regional security approach. I think you saw glimmers of this if anyone paid attention to General Eric Kurilla, the nominee to be the head of the CENTCOM. He had a hearing yesterday, I believe it was. And if you look at how he speaks about the region and the role that Iran plays in the region with ballistic missiles, with drones, with other things, we have in our military branch a clear-eyed view, because they know, and hundreds of Americans have been killed by Iranian proxies in Iraq and in other places. They know what the problems are. So the cheap debate that you see every day on Twitter and in our politics here is not the thing that the people who are on the front lines of America are really paying that much attention to. So that's one area. The second area is this issue of human rights, which, I used to work at the Center for American Progress, still affiliated with them. There's this weird thing on the so-called progressive left where it turns a blind eye to some of the worst human rights abuses across the board in the Middle East, but especially Iran. It pulls punches in ways that I think the reason why I've added when I talk about so-called progressives is when you look at journalists who were threatened with plots to kidnap them back to the country, or the congressman did mention Iranian Americans who are in detention. We had a summit for democracy here, hosted here by the Biden administration. And you could go back and look at the transcript, or you look at how many times actually the people of Iran were mentioned. Now, the fact that I just brought that up, and if anyone's tweeting this, and especially from the so-called progressive left, they'll be like, he's for regime change. But it shows you just how disconnected from, and understand my main point, how disconnected the Iran debate, and especially questions about the Jcpoa, have become disconnected from the regional security, and then also the lived experiences of the Iranian people. I would just cite two examples, and again, I'm not mean no disrespect to anyone who served in the Trump administration and things like this, or Obama. Ray, you were in the Obama administration, but when the Green Revolution happened early on, despite all of the happy talk from the left about human rights and democracy, what was actually done? Not much. When these protests in 2019, and I admired the op-ed I think Secretary Pompeo wrote, it was a wonderful op-ed. But what actual tools were delivered to actually help people protect themselves from the internet surveillance? And I think there were some, but quite clearly not enough, because the abuses continue. So going back to again, I'm not trying to avoid the question of deal or no deal. I suspect if there is one, it's not going to be a good one for security. It will not have learned the bigger lesson, which is that unless you improve the regional security conditions in the Middle East with a steadier approach, one that doesn't, like under Trump, tweet that we're out of Syria, but then not really do that, or imagine, like Biden, that we could pivot away to other regions. But it has a steadier approach and more long-term. And then secondly, that puts the focus on the people of Iran, because you all know this, there are tens of millions of people of Iran who want something different and in the next generation. But they're looking at America and they're wondering, is this democracy or this system even going to hang together itself? Which leads to my sort of concluding point, and I hope we can delve into this, is that I actually think the cheap politics of national security and the fact that we actually are somehow primed by the media and also by different interest groups that fund different organizations on the left and then also on the right, it actually ignores the opportunity for consensus. I'm really become more interested in my own thinking in what some people have called asset framing, the things that we actually have on your side that are strong. And we often forget this because there's something about I don't think this panel will go this way, but most debates about Iran or most national security debates, China, there's something that I think when you get out of the bubble, and I've done some of this research, and yes, most Americans, they're like, that doesn't make sense to me. We don't even understand what Jcpoa means. We just know that Iran is not doing good things, and we need a stronger, more full spectrum approach that uses all of these tools. So I hope we can get more into that. I think this panel was titled Beyond the Jcpoa. And understand my point. I think it's important, but there are two other important issues: the security of the region and the people of Iran.
Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you for having me here. I think one problem with the Iran policy is that it's not usually defined based on what's the narrow definition of U.S. national interest. And I want to answer that. So this is a regime whose goal is to weaken and destroy the United States. They say it publicly, they say it every day they say this to America, so you won't believe those people who say they don't mean it. And they actually have killed so many Americans. They have killed hundreds of Americans in Iraq. They have killed hundreds of Americans in Lebanon. Actually, before the 9/11, that was the largest number of casualties of Americans in a terrorist attack. So I think the only rational response by the United States is to plan to topple this regime. I think that should be clear. The rational response is not to enrich this regime. The rational response is not to hope that if we give them money, they become more moderate. But that doesn't make sense. And from that point of view, now we have a problem with them, the nuclear problem. Whatever solution we have there should not distract us from the larger goal, from the long-term goal. And the Jcpoa was a bad deal. The Trump administration rightly tried to kill it because it didn't have the zero enrichment. When you don't have the zero enrichment, you are actually making yourself hostage to the regime. Because then you cannot say anything about their terrorism. You cannot say anything about their human rights. You cannot say anything about the regional approach. And the reason you cannot say that is that the concessions that they have made, it's temporary, it's limited, and it's waning. Over time, you have the sunsets. So they can't, whatever concession they made, it's easily reversible. And the new deal that I think Rob Malley is going to have, as others said, it's worse than that. So I think they go back to it, but it would be much better if we have no deal. And no deal is better than this deal, I think.
Well, thanks everybody for your perspectives. I'll exercise my role as a moderator to play devil's advocate a bit. one of the things that we hear from the current administration is essentially that diplomacy works, that diplomacy is the best approach. And your successor, for example, and as spokesperson for the State Department, argues that, for example, if you look at the metrics that the last administration laid out for maximum pressure, has it actually succeeded? Iran's nuclear program has advanced. The regional activities that the U.S. is concerned about have also progressed. So in that sense, that's what Morgan was saying earlier, that you were saying that you think it's a false debate, that it's deal or war. But what are the alternatives? If we say that many of you say that that a return to the Jcpoa might not be a good thing, what are the alternatives? What do we have if not that? What are the tools that are there? Maybe we can go to reverse order. Do you want to start, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, look, first, the thing that we're not doing consistently and haven't in Biden, Trump, or Obama is to help our partners in the region defend themselves. And again, point taken about the strike on Soleimani. I think it was seismic and sent shockwaves inside of the Iranian regime's establishment. But what essentially we've had is strikes without strategy. We've had a number of, not just the ballistic missiles, but you see the drone attacks. Biden certainly has conducted, again, targeted strikes against militias and others that were backed by Iran. Israel, on a regular basis, and I'm ashamed to say that they actually feel the need, because we don't have a consistent security approach working with them. They conduct strikes to protect their own citizens in Syria. So number one is the things that successive administrations have talked about. When Obama, the year he signed the deal, there was a meeting at Camp David with the Gulf region to talk about getting things together and having a stronger defense. So the first thing I think is a stronger defense, and that requires a sense of interest about the Middle East, not sending this mixed signal of, well, we're back to basics, or we're going to have a very minimum approach. It's one that says we're going to work with partners. Some of them are quite flawed, to be clear, but I'm of the view that engagement with those partners, it makes them better and actually gives them more confidence. That's one thing. I think secondly, we need to be a heck of a lot more creative about mechanisms to engage the Iranian people. I briefly talked about sort of the internet protections and other things. But if you look at the human security crisis, and people in this room know a lot better than I do, but the human security, the water issues, the coronavirus, and other things, there's got to be ways, and if it's not US government, there's got to be ways to actually support the Iranian people in a lot of ways that, look, I don't want to get into a debate about regime change or not. It's just, we have a lot of tools to impose costs on regimes, which I think are important tools. But what we don't have are those tools and mechanisms to support people who actually want something different. And some of that something different might be just a better way of life. So I know of discussions, there's all these ongoing discussions between the Gulf states and Iran, which is an interesting, very nuanced, I wouldn't oversell it. But the fact that there are dire energy needs in parts of Iran, there's a very sophisticated full spectrum approach that the US could take. But coming back to the nuclear issue, if Iran continues to move forward on its nuclear program and its ballistic missiles and other things, there's going to, I don't know what to predict, but that will leave a lot of actors in the Gulf and in Israel deeply uneasy. So that's the central question that I think will come to the fore quite quickly. So all of these other tools I talked about will, I think, be overridden by this imperative need of, if it continues to progress, what then do we do about it?
Can I follow up on, I think the dynamic that you talked about, security and human rights, it's incredibly important, and I totally agree. I think one of the things that we're missing in this entire discussion, as you talked about, is this administration told us that they were going to lead with human rights. And while, you talked about the Secretary Pompeo's op-ed and the words, and the words and things that we said in the administration, I think that those supportive messages to the Iranian people matter. It's one of the reasons why, as State Department spokesperson, I tried almost on a weekly basis to do media that would get into Iran so the Iranian people could hear from me. We had a Persian Instagram at the State Department that was heavily followed. I think it's been disabled now. We had a Telegram channel during the 2019 protests where we asked people to send in to us pictures and videos of people that were killed, people that were arrested during these protests, because we wanted to name and shame and highlight. That account has either been disbanded or doesn't post anymore. Radio Farda, which was a tool that we used all the time at the State Department to try and communicate to the Iranian people, I don't think has posted in 350 days, or it's been downgraded significantly. And I bring that up because I do think that if you're going to say the administration leads with human rights, and if you're going to say that we care about the Iranian people, you're absolutely right that we have to do the tangible things to support them. But in my opinion, I've seen a communication effort that has essentially been silenced to the Iranian people for in favor of discussions for this flawed deal. And
yeah, if I could just add, I mean, this is one space where I actually think if you go to many of the Democrats, and I would say the majority in Congress, and you make this case, and quietly, but then this is a place where I think you could actually build consensus, even no matter what where the Iran nuclear deal goes itself, just because the loudest voices on the left in the spectrum aren't the ones that represent where the center is. The second thing, and why it's important what you said, to communicate to the Iranian people, the other thing, and I meant to mention this, is that our own very debate here, maybe even as we're having it, but the debate about Iran, I've joked that it's become so predictable, if you, sorry, my friends at FDD versus Quincy Institute or others, it's become so predictable what their analysis would be, coming from each side, that AI is getting so good, artificial intelligence, that you can replace some of these views with algorithms. Because you can guess where that debate will go. But the bigger point is that those divisions are exploited by regimes like Tehran's. I'll tell you why. If you haven't read the ODNI report from last spring, it wasn't just Russia interfering in our political debates and in our elections. It wasn't China, really. What was interesting about that is China pulled its punch and pulled back on it. But Iran documented evidence of trying to shape the debate that we have here in this country about the policy options here. That's what makes it even more confusing, is how do you actually disentangle legitimate policy differences from complicated politics already, add a layer to it of foreign interference, and you've got a confusing mess that the bigger picture of the lack of bipartisan consensus, or at least trying to work towards it on human rights, is exploited by regimes that are autocratic like Iran and others in the Middle East.
I want to add.
The debate actually within, I think there's a dark and dangerous streak in both parties that, on the far left and the far right, that favor isolationism. And within the Democratic Party, the party is not homogenous when it comes to Iran. You have Senators Bob Menendez, Chuck Schumer, and Cory Booker, and Representative Brad Sherman from California, very close to my district. And then we have
Nobody.
What's that?
Nobody.
Well, you know, and then we have, you know, the progressive left, as Brian put it. So even within the Democratic Party, we just saw Senator Menendez, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, making his dissatisfaction and concerns about the nuclear talks very public. And Rob Malley is going to, you know, have to show up and answer some questions. I think they just had a sort of a secure line classified briefing yesterday, right? So two things. A, there is that isolationist mood, even within President Trump's base. He has, in many rallies, he has talked about endless wars.
Yeah.
You know, I don't really know what endless wars mean. If you know, it's more of a sort of a, and this is also on the left. You know, endless wars. Okay, well, it's a nice punchline, but one of the tools so you can't have diplomacy without the real threat of force. And if you don't show up with a big stick, your carrots are not going to work. That's that. In my party, there is a diversity of views on this. Yes, you do have the progressive left, but again, I'm glad to say we do have Chuck Schumer, we do have Kamala Harris, we do have Senator Menendez, we do have Cory Booker, we do have Brad Sherman, and this is not slam dunk. And actually, so that when President Obama could not get 60 votes in the Senate because he could not. It was hard for him to actually get some Democratic senators, Senator Gillibrand of New York, Senator Schumer. So it is not a homogenous party on foreign policy. There's very diverse views, and people have very important and real serious concerns. Last, it is not just a nuclear issue. Iran's biggest threat, you have the missile program and you have the proxies. You have from Hezbollah to Hashd al-Sha'bi to the Houthis. You have a very growing and an extremely powerful network of armed proxies who are loyal and beholden to Tehran, to Ayatollah Khamenei, to Wilayat al-Faqih. And you have a missile program that is a threat. And now we see some of that drone and sort of missile program is being transferred to proxies in the region, and we're not exactly sure whether IRGC and Ghani, Ismail Ghani, has actually full control now over some elements of Hashd al-Sha'bi or some elements within the Houthis who are now launching these missiles. So the nuclear issue is important, but these are two big, huge 895-pound gorillas in the room. And they have to be dealt with.
Jim, let me respond to your question, which dealt with the nuclear issue per se, because all these other issues are salient, but the nuclear issue overshadows them. I think one of the things that the United States or its components cannot come to terms with is, what if there is no possibility of a deal? What if diplomacy has exhausted itself? What if there is no further arms control possibilities? Not so much a deficient deal, but any deal. What happens when the era of arms control agreement has closed and we're not aware of it? What do you do about the program then? Because everybody agrees that the agreement that is going to be negotiated will not impede Iran's surge toward the nuclear weapon. Maybe there is no agreement that will do that. So now what? I think it's one of the things that you can do is stop thinking about diplomacy as regulating or tempering Iran's nuclear ambitions, but draw certain red lines.
Right.
And then pledge to enforce those red lines with force. Now, let me just say one thing about red lines. Don't draw them unless you're prepared to enforce it. And these red lines at this stage have to be explicit. We don't want you to install advanced centrifuges. We don't want you to have this level of enrichment. And if these red lines are transgressed, we will respond with the use of force. But I don't know if anybody's prepared to do that. Let me just say one more thing about regime change, because I work in the Carter archives. Somebody said the United States, I think you did, has never had a regime change policy. In December 1979, Jimmy Carter signed a presidential directive enjoining the CIA to change the Iranian regime. That's a matter of record. You can look it up. I know a lot of people here don't like to believe that. But the Jimmy Carter had a regime change policy in December 1979. And it is reported, nobody has confirmed it to me, that President Trump, at the tail end of his term, actually signed a similar presidential directive. If this is true, on 2 occasions, United States presidents have committed their government to change the Iranian regime. I know a lot more about the Carter one, but I'm not going to digress. Let me just say one more thing about the internal Iranian situation, if I can. Iran is not a land of autocratic stability. It's a land of work stoppages, protests. Every segment of society is energized against the regime. Usually protests began as economic grievances, but they very quickly take political coloration. The question at hand is not whether there is domestic political opposition to the regime that is widespread, deep and wide, that encompasses every class, including the lower classes, which were thought of being tied to the regime traditionally by piety and patronage. The Islamic Republic has no constituency to speak of. And in my opinion, the security services will prove unreliable in times of crisis. The relevant question is, what can the United States do to impact this internal debate? I've had a lot of discussions like this, and I have chaired some of them. And I always say, if we're going to talk about how to impact the Iranian domestic political situation, how do you exacerbate the internal vulnerabilities of the regime? We're going to talk about that. And I don't want to talk about our broadcasts. Tell me what else you have other than broadcasts. That's when the conversation stops. All these things are fine, but tell me what other measures we have to exacerbate those difficulties, energize this opposition, without talking about broadcasts, because that's what everybody talks about. And I understand its appeal, and I understand its importance, but as they say, if you watch NBA TV, what's the second level analysis? Let me tell you what the first level analysis is. First level analysis is, when you're playing LeBron James, stop him from scoring. The second level analysis is, how do you do that? So I've been in a lot of these conversations. I don't particularly have a response to it. My dear friend Ruel Gurek and I have written about this a few times, but I like to think about that issue. So there's 2 issues I'm going to put in front of you, if I may, to summarize. Number 1, I don't believe there's an arms control agreement here. I don't believe the United States can negotiate an arms control agreement that's reliable and a sturdy barrier to Iranian nuclear proliferation. Therefore, now what? And it is my opinion that the Iranian regime hold on power is tenuous. What role does the United States have to further attenuate its sources of strength? Those are the two issues I want to put in front of you, if I can, please.
Thanks. Let me, it's something that I think all of you have touched on in your remarks to a certain extent. One of the arguments back in 2015, and that I'm sure we'll hear soon as well if the deal is reached, is that the nuclear issue is paramount, and that essentially this puts Iran in a box, this creates some limits, the JCPOA, but then there's the debate, are there other issues, and could this potentially eventually lead to discussions of something on other concerns that the US might have with Iran, if it's missiles, if it's regional activities. How do you feel about that? I mean, do you think that the focus is right on the nuclear issue, and in that sense, how do you see, particularly the diplomatic path, how would you envision that in the future if we want to address
Should we
other
let
things? Is
Saeed
it even
go?
possible? Sorry, please.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what was said about max pressure. It was only in place for 2 years. It imposed massive cost on the regime. And in 2019, you had the largest protest in Iran in its 43 years history. It was greater than the 1979 revolution. And they had to kill more than 1,500 people to oppress it. So it's not that the max pressure failed. It was 2 years in place, then you had a new administration, which literally killed it. So if you look at all the numbers, all the trade numbers, all the export numbers, there is no max pressure anymore. So that on max pressure. On the nuclear front, look, we have to resurrect the max pressure. We have to have the max pressure 2, expand it, work with the Iranian people who are our allies in this fight with the regime. And there are measures we can do. I will talk about them if Ray wants. But we have to make it clear to the regime, you cannot have this nuclear program. How we can do it? By make it clear to them that there will be a military option. And we have to make it clear to them that this military option threat is credible. What the Trump administration did with Soleimani was good in the sense that made it clear to them that there can be costs. There should have been more, but right now we can have that military deterrence, I think. The Biden administration can go back to that policy, show the Iranian regime that they cannot have the nuclear power. I think that's the only option. These negotiations, they will give you a deal which is not good. Iran keeps its nuclear at an industrial level inside Iran. Whenever they want, they go back to enriching uranium and making the bomb.
Sure. Anybody else? How about the issue that in 2015 it actually did impose limits on the nuclear program?
But it imposed, it just kicked the can down the road, right? Only in Washington, D.C. will we pat ourselves on the back for making the nuclear problem someone else's issue, right, with the sunset provisions. So we could, listen, we could fight all day about the efficacy of the JCPOA, and I think that we've all done that now for 6 years. But, I think what you said about red lines are incredibly important. I had it in my notes. Did you read my notes?
Well,
no, I'm kidding. I'm just saying I agree with you. But what we're all saying here, I think, variations on a theme, is that there has to be teeth behind the diplomacy, right? When we took out Soleimani in January of 2020, fast forward, what was it, August, September, that we saw the Abraham Accords, that we saw the region start to come together, and agree or disagree with President Trump, the whole world knew that he meant business, and I think taking out Soleimani was instrumental in people believing that. So you have to ask yourself, is the Biden administration prepared to walk away from the JCPOA from these discussions? I don't think they are. And I don't think they are because if you look at Afghanistan, it's clear where President Biden's head is that he wants out. He's focused on Russia, obviously, but even in Russia, where's the offensive weaponry a year ago that we could have been given to the Ukrainians? There's a lot of threats about what we will do if Russia invades, but there's in my mind, there's not enough action behind that early on. It's just threat after threat after threat. Syria red lines that we saw during the Obama administration. It's all, to me, it feels like a circular pattern. So I guess what I'm saying is we're all debating and saying we need to be prepared to walk away from the table, or we need to have a threat of force behind our diplomacy in order for it to be effective. I agree with all of that. I just don't think that this administration has any teeth to do that. I think that they want to pivot towards China, which we spend a lot of time, focusing on China. So I certainly agree with that. But this administration is going to get a terribly flawed deal, worse than 2015, because they are not prepared to walk away and they're not prepared to use any force.
Yeah, so I think a fundamental mistake in this round of negotiations that did not learn the lesson from 2015 and beyond is trying to wall off these regional security issues and only talk about the nuclear file.
Yeah.
Now, I get the argument that if you try to open up Yemen, Syria, Iraq, it's a can of worms. But essentially, I don't fundamentally believe that negotiating with the representatives of this regime on those issues at a table will produce much results. What will likely produce results is if we have a more coherent regional security approach and follow through on things. So whether it was the Obama idea in 2015 to work with partners in the GCC and Israel to strengthen their defenses, and a 10-year accord with Israel on their security, which the Trump administration continued to implement with Israel, and the Biden administration. Again, there was a bipartisan consensus to do that, despite the phrase and the noise, not to do that. In the Trump administration, great idea on, they called it Arab NATO, a great idea to bring it together. And I know some of our common friends in the Trump administration tried to work on it for a variety of reasons, including disarray amongst the Arab camp, the boycott against Qatar. That's all over. The region's in this interesting period right now in 2022 where there are new openings. You mentioned the Abraham Accords. To me, this is one of the areas that I actually think you see quite visibly things happening now, in part as a result of that. Joint military exercises that, to me, aren't enough, but are a step in the right direction to remind the regime in Iran who actually has the strength and force in play here. And there's strength in numbers and in cooperation. And that's where I think, again, the Biden administration has been a little bit absent from the scene. Not the military, as I mentioned with General Kurilla and CENTCOM. They're there. They see it every day. The Biden administration's overall strategy, and again, not to just blame this administration, it's part of our own dysfunction in America. You mentioned it too, the phrase on the left and the right, why should we even care to stay engaged in the Middle East? This, I think, has already become a key problem in the Democratic Party. But again, they punch far above what their actual electoral weight is.
I know I'm not the moderator, but
Yeah.
what do you think? Sorry. But
Yeah.
All good,
but the Graham and Menendez bill that they introduced today, I don't know if the two of you have
I
thoughts
didn't
on
see it yet. No, sorry.
So
Yeah.
it's essentially like the 1, 2, 3 agree. I think that's how I interpret it. Sort of sharing nuclear power, but no one. Is that, it's bipartisan? Is that feasible? Is that?
It should be. It should be part of the discussion. But that's what I'm saying is that I know that was actually in the works for almost a year.
Yeah.
But it's not the feature, again, you click on your Twitter and those most prominent Iran policy analysts, they're not promoting that jointly. They're mostly fighting on the phrase, and some of it are important issues. But the bigger point is that then their role as opinion formers in our debate erodes the potential for consensus that is necessary to take on a challenge like Iran, a country that is fundamentally so much weaker than us and our partners in the Middle East. Yet we allow, our own openness and our own democratic system, we allow sort of those divisions to be used against us to get to that coherent approach. But understand what I'm saying, Shaun, is that the key issue, a mistake, I think, not to have those issues of ballistic missiles on the table, the support for terror. I don't think it's any coincidence that these attacks, like what we've seen from the Houthis in the UAE, the timing of that is not just a coincidence. Iran does negotiate through its own actions and through its proxies in the region. We should do the same when a punch is thrown. And again, understand what I'm saying is that I'm not just blaming Biden or Trump or Obama or even Bush. but we quite often pull punches, in part because we don't have that strategic, coherent, long-term approach in the Middle East. We're either going to get out or we're going to fix things overnight. What we need is a steadier approach, and to get there, we actually need to just stop the nonsense debates in our politics about tough issues like Iran.
A lot of what we have done so far has been tactical and surgical, not strategic.
Yeah.
And that's. Look, I want to sort of go to a domestic aspect of things. The Biden administration is not doing very well in the polls. We got the midterms coming up. About a third, exactly a third of the U.S. Senate is up for re-election, and the entire U.S. House of Representatives. Right now, I think we hold the majority by a margin of 220 to 212. The speaker is. But two things have gone well. Morgan said the administration is not willing to walk away. Well, if you're at a poker game, and you got to get up and leave at some point. You know, you can't just keep going all in, and lose everything, and your kids, college fund. So you just can't. The Biden administration, if things get better domestically, the economy is doing better. At least job numbers are showing so. The redistricting has. We thought we're going to have a very tough time with redistricting. It seems that actually we're picking up a few seats. So when Democrats feel better about, hey, 2020, the midterms is not going to be 2020, we just had an election. It's not going to be a shellacking, as President Obama put it. It will strengthen President Biden's hand, in my opinion, to be able to walk away. The administration is really looking for a big foreign policy victory. They're looking for some big victory. I mean, we had the infrastructure bill. Where is the messaging on that? This billions of dollars, being spent. Where is the messaging on that? So as the president's domestic hand and as congressional Democrats' domestic situation and electoral situation going to the 2022 election gets better and gets strengthened, I think it will also strengthen President Biden's ability to be more flexible foreign policy-wise. We should not stay and negotiate for the sake of getting a deal when we know we may not get one, and we're not willing to walk away.
Sure. If I could just interrupt you, I think we wanted to do some questions from the audience. If anybody has anything to say, sir,
Yeah, hi. My question goes to Ms. Ortagus. And at the time when 90% of Iranians were inspiring regime change, how did the administration come up with regime's change of behavior? I mean, how could the mafia
Can you
group...
say that again? How did the administration come up with what?
Regime's change of behavior.
like how can we change the behavior of the regime?
He said when people were chanting for regime change, the Iranian people, how did the Trump administration go from regime change to just regime behavioral changes or change of behavior? So.
Well, I don't think it was ever the policy of the Trump administration for regime change. The one thing that President Trump consistently said is that Iran would never get a nuclear weapon on his watch. And I think that we tried to take all appropriate action that we could to ensure that that was possible.
Well,
Should we, unless you have a quick follow-up, do you, sir?
Hi, yes, please. First of all, I'd like to thank NUFDI for this extraordinary and wonderful event. I want to advance another thesis, and that is that there's no need for regime change. The Islamic Republic has actually collapsed. If you look at them economically, politically, on every women's rights, on virtually any front, the regime in Iran has collapsed. What I think we're lacking is kind of like when the coyote runs over the precipice. No one's showing them that there's nothing under this regime. And the analogy here has often been, you know, America defeated the Soviet Union. We didn't plan for regime change, but we sure as hell knew that we need to fight them. Islamic fundamentalism in Iran is dead. That's why we're all here. The real question is, when will the world wake up to it? Thank you.
Can I just say one thing in relations to the nuclear issue? Because one of the most ridiculous figures that has been introduced is a breakout time. Breakout time is a completely ridiculous figure that actually works to the disadvantage of any American negotiating team. Because breakout time measures how much fissile material they have. What matters is the hard infrastructure. But any deal that produces, they're going to come out with an 18-month breakout period, which is a ridiculous figure. But if you want to change the way we think about the nuclear issue and the priority of the nuclear issue over all other concerns, I would actually dispense with the figure breakout line, because it does, breakout time and Iran having nuclear weapons are very two different things. That's, in terms of just the metrics of this issue, work to the disadvantage of the American negotiating team, because you're in a perpetual state of crisis because of the breakout period.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Thank you. My name is Farah Hatasi. I am the founder of the Syrian American Task Force for Syria. I am also founding member of the High Negotiation Committee and former spokesperson for the Syrian opposition in Geneva. So I have actually an observation and two questions. We'll start with the first one. Probably I am the only or few non-Iranian in this crowd. However, my country, Syria, and my people suffered from the Islamic regime more than any nation in the Middle East. Yes, Iran fought a proxy war and still fighting in Lebanon through Hezbollah and in Yemen through Houthi. However, it's a different case in Syria. Iran fought for existence in Syria. There were Iranian boots on the ground. There is estimated 3,000 thugs, I would say, militia of Qasem Soleimani who were killed in Syria. They spilled blood. They defended Assad regime as they are defended the Malali in Tehran. They detained, tortured Syrian people. So after all of this genocide, after the Holocaust that happened in Syria, the 12 million displaced, the 3 million refugees, after all of that bloodshed, do you think, that's my question to Brian actually, do you think all of this will be wasted and sacrificed at the negotiation right now with Biden administration to sign the nuclear deal? And do you think they will go for recycling a war criminal, Bashar al-Assad, and normalize ties with him eventually? That's question to you. And my question to Megan, since you worked with an official member of the Trump administration, because through our 11-year struggle for the Syrian cause, the main question we hear from our friends, whether in the administration or even in Europe, yeah, you have a legitimate cause to fight Bashar al-Assad, but who is your alternative? You don't have an alternative, even though we know that's a wrong narrative, because we have so many capable Syrian leaders who can step up and fill the vacuum. We have defected officials from the Syrian regime who are now with us, with the opposition. So we know this is just an excuse for the US administration or our friends for the non-action in Syria, no policy. But in case of Iran, that's different. And that's a question always really, frustrates me. They have a legitimate leader here. They have a legitimate crown prince who spent at least half of his life defending the cause. It really frustrates me, or always ask, why the US administration, whether it's Democrat or whether it's Republican, why they don't invest in that young prince? The whole community, I'm sorry,
Thank you.
I am non-Iranian, but always they say, who is the alternative? He is 10 minutes away from the White House. One photo ops with Biden or Trump, it will change the rule of the game. Why they don't empower him? Why they don't invest in him, giving him the right tool and have him as one powerful force to regime change. Any regime changes in Iran will reflect
we have a couple more people,
good
just a minute
on
left.
Syria and the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Maybe just quickly you could ask, and then we could just wrap up. Because we're
Thank
just
you.
running out
My
of time.
name is Shahram Makwi. I'm coming from Los Angeles. I'm not a politician. I'm a neurosurgeon. The question is for Morgan, mainly. Morgan, as you know, administration after administration has talked about regime change as if it's a poisonous, radioactive, subject to touch. And it's mainly because of the progressive left that makes this such a bad-looking, idea. Having said that, the main solution to not only Iran, but the whole Middle East and stability of the world is change of regime in Iran. That's the only solution. And the past 43 years explains and proves what I'm talking about right now. And if the people of Iran, over the past 3 or 4 years, vocally are putting their lives in the streets and asking for assistance from the United States and the international community to help for regime change, not by the Iraqi-style 2003 invasion. Why is it that, for example, during the 4 years of Trump administration, when there were 2 revolutions in Iran, in December of 2017 and in November of 2019, over 200 cities of Iran had protests. People asking for that exact same thing, regime change in Iran. Why is it that it's such a bad topic to make United States policy actually pursuing and helping what the Iranian people are asking, which the absolute majority are asking that? Why is it that, and also the point is, as the lady mentioned, people in Iran have been asking for Prince Reza Pahlavi to be as a figure for the transition, not necessarily the monarchy or kingdom, and he lives 30 minutes away from White House. From what I understand, is not even a single time during the 4 years of Trump administration.
Sorry, just to be conscious of everybody's time, because we're just about out here. Maybe just very briefly.
So please, Morgan, if you can.
Well, I love it. It's funny.
Morgan, you're very popular.
I-
Yeah.
Very popular.
When I was in the,
We elected Morgan as a spokesperson.
when I was in the administration,
Can you answer
we
my
were,
questions too?
When I was in the administration, I was getting hit, we were getting hit from you guys saying that we were warmongers, and you guys said we don't do enough. Okay, so maybe we did something right, hopefully. So to answer your question directly, why don't we talk about regime change? It's obvious because we screwed up in Iraq. And that's not what the American people want to hear. If you look at, you talked about this earlier, if you look at both political parties, if you go to Tennessee, where I live right now, and ask Americans whose kids are 18 years old and fighting age, should my son or daughter go die for regime change in Iran, they're going to tell you no. So I know that I'm laying out the dynamics to you, and that there's just no political appetite in the United States for a military regime change. Now, what you want is for us to be more supportive of the Iranian people. Totally agree with that. We tried to do everything we could in the Trump administration to support the Iranian people. I think what Brian said is really appropriate, that we need to come up with more tangible ways to support the American people.
One tangible
the
way,
Iranian people.
one tangible way, if I may, just one
Sorry,
second.
I've been told that we're just about finished. So I think on this, Morgan will have the last word. But thanks for everybody for joining us in this discussion. Thank you.
Hey, great to see you. Enjoyed your remarks. All right, man, nice to see you. I'll email you.
Thanks.
We have one question. Should